In this video, we're going to go over some cool features that aren't necessarily drawing tools, but they're potentially going to be very helpful to you as you create and manage your drawings. So one of the big issues with boarding that Storyboard Pro is great at dealing with is the fact that a lot of the content from panel to panel is the same, especially backgrounds. So let's look at this scenario where we have one panel and we're ready to draw the next one. The easiest thing to do would be to duplicate the panel. But now we have the extra step of selecting and clearing everything off the character layer. So a better way might be to use Smart Duplicate, which lets us duplicate only the layers that we want. So we select the layers with the content we want to duplicate. Then it copies those layers and gives us the rest of whatever is set up to be our default layer set. So now we're ready to draw the next pose for the character. We want them to be in the same screen position and the same size as the last panel. To make that easier, we can use the onion skinning toolbar. If you enable this, it will show you a semi-transparent version of the panels before and after. You can control how far ahead and behind you want it to show with these drop-downs. If you want to show more than 3 panels ahead or behind, you can click this, Expand Onion Skin, and then with this toolbar you can enable a much wider range. And you can use this slider or the play button here to scrub through the panels to see how things are lining up. And finally, if there's a drawing on a particular layer that you don't want to show up in the onion skinning, you can toggle this little option on a layer to exclude it from onion skinning. So that let us easily do some more poses for the character. But now, suppose we find out there's some other element that we need in the shot. How do we most easily add it to all these panels? We can add it in the first panel, and then copy that layer, and paste it in the next panel. But there's a way that's even easier than that. We can use Shift-click to select all our remaining panels in this shot, and come up to Layer, Paste Layers Special. Then we want to set the cycle options to hold once, and you can see it's going to add it to each of our panels. Then if we had modified an existing layer and wanted to replace it on all the panels, we can check Overwrite Existing Layers with the same name. But we made a new layer with a new name, so that doesn't matter. And lastly, you can choose to put the layer we're pasting at the bottom of the layer stack. Otherwise, the default behavior is to add it to the top. Then we click OK, and it adds it to all the panels. Unfortunately, we still have to put it in the right place in the stack. Now imagine we get word back that there was some change to that new element we added. We could just change it and special paste it again, but to make sure this doesn't happen again, this time I'm going to right-click and make it a shared drawing. You can see that it now has this asterisk by its name to indicate that it's a shared drawing. Now I'm going to special paste it like we did before, and this time I do want to replace the layers with the same name. And that shared drawing is now on every panel. So what's special about a shared drawing is that if I make a change in one panel, that change shows up everywhere the drawing is used. So for any frequently used element, like backgrounds and things, you might as well make them shared drawings just in case. Also, if you go over to the Library tab and look in the Shared folder here, you can see that shared drawings get saved here. You can drag it out and add it to any panel if you want to reuse it. Also, while we're here, if there's any other piece of artwork you want to save to reuse, you can save it to the library. You can see in the template folder, there's a bunch of general ones that come with Storyboard Pro. You can just drag one onto the stage to use it. But you can also make your own. Let's make a folder to put our stuff in. And then we just take a drawing layer from one of our panels and drag it into the library. and you can see it gets saved as a .tpl file. Then you can reuse that whenever you need it. Keep in mind, these are not linked together like shared drawings are, so you can change them as much as you want. If you build up a library of commonly reused things like head positions and expressions for your characters, that could save you a lot of time. Next, I just have two more cool tricks to show you. One is for vector layers, and the other is for bitmap layers. Let's start with vector layers. So I have a background, and I'm going to draw a character over top of it. But it's hard to see the character without them being filled in. So I could use the paint bucket tool, or set a brush to paint behind mode and fill them in by hand, but there's an easier way. I'll just go to Layer, Generate Auto Matte. So what this is going to do is detect the edges of my drawing and create a layer behind it filled in with a flat color. The radius is kind of like the gap detection on the paint bucket tool. It determines how far apart edges of your lines need to be considered an open space that it should fill in. What's best kind of depends on how loose your drawing style is, so try it out with different settings. Then we pick a color for the matte. It defaults to whatever the currently selected color is, but you can also switch it to custom and pick a new color. Then you can choose whether to copy the strokes of your drawing to the new matte layer. I generally leave that off. Then just click OK, and it made a matte named after the layer we had selected. Then I like to group those layers together. Now I'm going to change the drawing and do Generate Auto Matte again. I'm going to turn down the radius to try to make the matte a little tighter. And when I click OK, it will detect the previous matte by its name and ask if we want to replace it, which we do. And remember, since these mattes are vector objects, you can select them and modify their color after the fact. If you think you're going to use this feature, you definitely want to go to your preferences and assign it a keyboard shortcut. So the Auto Matte feature only works on vector layers. But now let's look at a special feature for bitmap layers. If I right-click on this bitmap layer, at the bottom we have Apply Effects on Bitmap Layer. The first one is Blur. The higher this radius setting, the blurrier the image will be. This is great if you want a depth of field or out of focus camera effect. But beware, because this does permanently alter the artwork on the layer. So you might want to copy the layer or save it to the library before doing any of these. The next effect you can apply is Radial Zoom Blur. This lets you blur the layer in such a way that it looks like it's spinning or it's zooming toward or away from the camera. But there's something you'll want to do beforehand. So I'm going to put a zoom blur effect on this background, but I want to figure out where I want the focus point of the zoom to be. I actually want it over here. We want all these trees to be blurred as if they're whipping past us as we travel toward this point. So with my cursor over that point, down here we can see it reads out the coordinates of the cursor. I'm just going to note those down. Then go back to the radial zoom blur effect, and for the focus, we just enter those coordinates. It's a little confusing because the cursor indicator on the stage used negative and positive numbers, but here it uses north, south, east, and west. Just go ahead and input the numbers as you noted them, and it will interpret them correctly. Then here, under Presets, we have choices for different directions of spins and spirals. And here in the center, we have zooming towards and zooming away. We want the blur to make it look like the background is zooming towards us. So we'll pick that one. And then set the blurriness value. And we can have the blur run bidirectionally or not. In this case, it'll be better not to. Then we just click OK. And there's our cool zoom effect. Now let's look at another example. This time we're going to do a directional blur. So this is going to blur in a specific direction as if something is zipping across the screen really fast. Now our options here are length, which means the length of the blur in the direction that we specify with our angle. And width is the blur perpendicular to that angle. So you probably want this one to be way lower than your length to increase that sense of directionality. Then the angle sets the direction of the blur. Here are some examples of what direction each angle would mean. Then bidirectional sets whether to blur in both directions along our angle or just one. In our example here, we just want the one direction. Then fall off determines how far away from the edge of our starting image the blur will be visible. So kind of like how long a trail is the blur leaving. If the fall off is 0, the blur will go the full distance we have set for the length. And the higher the fall off, the faster the trail falls off, and therefore the shorter it gets. We want ours to be long, so we'll keep this low. Then increasing the number of iterations increases the number of times the effect runs, which will make a smoother blur, but it takes longer to render out. And there we have it. Now these blur effects only work on bitmap layers. But remember, you could always just duplicate a vector layer and convert it to bitmap if you want to put an effect on it. That's it for our advanced drawing layer tricks. We're finally ready to get back to our example board and use all of the drawing tools we've gone over to do our first pass. We'll do that in the next video. I'll see you there.